All right, so you guys want to talk about the Mandela effect?
Yep.
I've got some articles here from SCORE and Psychology Today and Healthline,
Oh,
and they're all talking about this crazy phenomenon where large groups of people all have the same false memories.
right.
So we want to kind of get to the bottom of how and why that happens.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, how can that be?
Right.
That it's not just little memory slips, like forgetting where you put your keys or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like these major things that people are like, no, I remember it this way, and it turns out it never happened.
Yeah, it's like really vivid memories, too.
Exactly. And a lot of people have them.
Like it all started with Nelson Mandela.
Right.
Like tons of people remember him dying in prison back in the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
But he was actually released in 1990 and lived until 2013.
Yeah, that's how the term Mandela effect was even coined.
Yeah.
That one case, I think, really captured people's imaginations, and it's wild.
And it really kicked off this whole discussion about collective false memories. Speaking of collective false memories, we have to talk about the Berenstain Bears.
Oh, here we go.
Tell me, I'm not the only one who remembers it being spelled Berenstein with an E.
Oh, yeah, the Berenstain Bears.
Was there some mass renaming I missed, or is our collective memory just totally messing with us?
Yeah, it's a classic example of the Mandela effect.
It is.
I think it really highlights how our memories aren't like these perfect recordings of the past. They're more like these reconstructions
Okay.
where our brain is piecing together these fragments of information.
Yeah.
And sometimes those pieces don't quite fit.
So our brains are just filling in the gaps with whatever seems to make sense.
Exactly. And that's what psychologists call confabulation.
Confabulation.
Yeah, it's where we unintentionally create these false memories.
Oh, wow.
Often to try and create a more coherent or logical narrative in our minds.
Okay, so it's like our brains are saying, hey, this memory doesn't quite make sense.
Right.
Let me just tweak it a little bit to make it work.
Yeah, exactly. Let me smooth this over.
That makes sense. But it's still kind of unsettling.
Yeah.
Like how much of what we remember is actually accurate.
Right. How much can we really trust our memories?
Yeah. And it gets even more complex when you think about the social aspect of memory.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's not like we're forming these memories in isolation.
Right.
We're constantly talking to people, sharing our experiences.
Yeah.
And sometimes those shared experiences can actually contaminate our memories.
Totally. It's like a game of telephone.
Totally.
Where the message gets a little more distorted with each retelling.
Yes.
And the SCORE article talks a lot about that, this
Yeah.
idea of social contagion.
Yeah.
Where false memories can spread through these social networks.
Right.
And then become reinforced through these shared beliefs and conversations.
So even if we start with a relatively accurate memory,
right.
it can get distorted over time as we talk to other people and hear their versions of events.
Yeah, and this is especially true for events that are emotionally charged.
Yeah.
Or culturally significant. Those are the memories we tend to rehearse and retell more often.
Right.
And each retelling is just another opportunity for distortion.
Yeah, that's kind of mind-blowing.
It is.
It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know is actually true.
Right.
Or if it's just a product of social influence.
Yeah, it's a fascinating and kind of unsettling thought.
Yeah.
And it raises some important questions about how we form our beliefs.
Totally.
And how we even distinguish between fact and fiction.
So are you saying we should be questioning everything we think we know?
Well, not necessarily everything, but I think it's definitely healthy to cultivate
Okay.
the sense of critical thinking and skepticism, especially when it comes to information that's widely shared or emotionally charged.
Yeah.
The Mandela effect, I think, is just a great reminder that our memories aren't always as reliable as we think they are.
Okay, so we've established our memories can be pretty unreliable, especially when social influence is involved.
For sure.
But I got to ask, are there certain types of information that are more susceptible to the Mandela effect
That's a great question.
than others?
And it's something that researchers are still trying to figure out. But
Okay.
based on all the popular examples we've seen,
Yeah.
it seems like names, phrases, and logos are particularly vulnerable to distortion.
That's interesting.
Yeah, why do you think that is?
I don't know. Why do you think that is?
Well, one possibility is that those types of information are often processed
Okay.
shallowly.
Yeah.
You might see a logo or hear a phrase without really paying close attention
Yeah.
to the details. And then when our brains try to recall that information later,
Yeah.
they have to fill in the gaps, and that's where the errors can creep in.
So it's like our brains are taking shortcuts, and sometimes those shortcuts lead to dead ends.
Exactly. And this is especially true when the information is ambiguous
Right.
or open to interpretation. For example, the Berenstain Bears name
Yeah.
is somewhat unusual, like it doesn't quite follow the typical spelling rules. So our brains might try to correct it to a more familiar form.
Right, like Berenstain.
Like Berenstain, exactly.
Okay, so we're not necessarily intentionally making things up.
Right,
Our brains are just trying to make sense of the world in the most efficient way possible.
exactly. And sometimes that efficiency comes at the cost of accuracy.
All right, so far we've talked about the Berenstain Bears and Nelson Mandela.
Right.
But what about other examples? There's got to be more, right?
Oh, there are plenty.
Like, what? Give me an example that'll make me question everything.
Okay, how about this? Darth Vader never actually said, "Luke, I am your father."
Wait, what?
Hold on.
Hold on. Are you serious?
I am completely serious.
Wow.
The actual line is, "No, I am your father."
But everyone knows it's Luke, I am your father.
I know.
It's one of the most iconic lines in movie history.
Right, and that's a perfect example of how pop culture and collective memory can distort
Right.
even the most famous quotes.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen that movie a million times.
Right.
And I could have sworn he said Luke. This is messing with my head.
It's a powerful illustration of how our memories aren't always as accurate as we believe them to be.
Okay.
We often remember things the way we want to remember them or the way they've been reinforced
Right.
through repeated exposure.
So if we can't even trust our memories of Star Wars, what can we trust?
Right.
This is getting deep.
It is deep, and it leads us to a crucial question. If our memories are so susceptible to distortion,
Yeah.
how do we navigate a world that relies so heavily on accurate information?
That's a great question, and I think it's one that we need to explore further.
Yeah.
But for now, let's take a step back
Yeah.
and consider some of the psychological factors
Okay.
that might be contributing to the Mandela effect.
Sounds good.
Okay,
There's a lot more to unpack here,
there is.
and I'm sure our listeners are eager to learn more.
I'm sure they are.
So
We'll be back.
we'll be right back. So before the break, we were talking about how our memories can be influenced by other people.
Right, like how we tend to gravitate towards information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Exactly.
Like if I already think it's Berenstain Bears,
Yeah.
I'm more likely to notice and remember other people saying Berenstain too.
Exactly. That's called confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias.
And it plays a huge role in how we process information
Wow.
and form memories. It's like we're wearing these invisible filters
Hey.
that only let in information that aligns with what we already believe.
So even if we're exposed to the correct information,
Right.
like seeing the actual Berenstain Bears logo,
Right.
our brains might just like brush it off
Yeah.
as an exception or a mistake.
That's one possibility. Or we might reinterpret the information to fit our existing belief.
Okay.
Like, for example, someone might say, "Oh, they must have changed the spelling back to Berenstain recently."
Wow. Our brains are really good at protecting those cherished beliefs,
They are.
even if they're based on faulty memories.
They are. And this is where the Psychology Today article comes in. It talks about how our memories are organized into these mental frameworks called schemas.
Schemas, okay.
Yeah, think of them like mental filing cabinets
Okay.
where we store information about the world.
So schemas are like our brain's way of like categorizing and making sense of all the information we encounter.
Exactly. And when we encounter new information, our brains try to fit it into these existing schemas.
Okay.
And if it doesn't quite fit, we might either tweak the information or tweak the schema itself.
So in the case of the Berenstain Bears,
Right.
our schema for that book series might be so strong
Yeah.
that even when we see the correct spelling, our brains just file it away under Berenstain.
That's the idea. Schemas can be incredibly powerful.
Right.
And they can sometimes lead us astray, especially when they're based on inaccurate information.
So it sounds like schemas are kind of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they help us organize information and make sense of the world.
Right.
But on the other hand, they can make us resistant to new information and more likely to cling to those false memories.
That's a great way to put it. Schemas are essential for cognitive efficiency,
Right.
but they can also contribute to biases and distortions in our thinking.
Okay, so we've talked about confirmation bias schemas, social contagion,
Right.
even confabulation.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It seems like there's a whole army of cognitive biases working against us when it comes to forming accurate memories.
There are.
It's kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
It can be overwhelming, but remember, awareness is the first step.
Okay.
By understanding these biases, we can start to recognize when they might be influencing our thinking.
So what can we do to protect ourselves from falling prey to the Mandela effect?
That's a great question.
Are there any like mental exercises or strategies we can use?
Yeah.
to strengthen our memories and make them more reliable?
Absolutely. One of the most effective strategies is to engage in active recall.
Active recall.
Yeah, this involves retrieving information from your memory without looking at notes or other aids. It's like giving your brain a workout.
So instead of just passively reading something over and over,
Right.
we should actively try to remember it without peeking.
Exactly. And the more you practice active recall, the stronger those memory pathways become.
That makes sense. It's like building muscle memory, but for our brains.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Another powerful technique is spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition.
Yeah.
This involves revisiting information at increasing intervals.
So instead of cramming everything in at the last minute, we should spread out our studying over time.
Precisely, spaced repetition helps solidify memories and prevent them from fading over time.
Okay, so active recall and spaced repetition.
Yeah.
Those are definitely going on my list of memory boosting strategies.
Could be.
But even with the best techniques, it seems like we're all still susceptible to the Mandela effect.
To some degree, yeah.
To some degree, is there anything else we can do to minimize the risk of falling for these collective false memories?
One of the best things you can do is to cultivate a healthy sense of skepticism.
Don't just blindly accept everything you hear or read, even if it comes from a seemingly credible source.
So fact check everything.
Exactly. And don't just rely on one source, cross-reference information.
Right.
Consult multiple perspectives and look for evidence to support or refute claims.
So it sounds like critical thinking is the ultimate weapon against the Mandela effect.
It is. And remember, it's okay to admit when you don't know something or when you've made a mistake. Nobody has a perfect memory.
Right.
And that's okay.
That's actually quite reassuring.
Yeah.
It takes the pressure off, you know?
Yeah.
We don't have to be walking encyclopedias.
Right.
It's more important to be open to learning and revising our beliefs as we encounter new information.
Absolutely. The Mandela effect is a fascinating reminder that our understanding of the world is constantly evolving.
It is.
What we believe to be true today might change tomorrow, and that's okay.
All right, so we've talked about some strategies for strengthening our memories and becoming more critical thinkers.
Right.
But I'm curious, what about the flip side? What are some of the potential consequences of the Mandela effect? Could these collective false memories have real-world implications?
That's an important question. And while the Mandela effect is often treated as a lighthearted curiosity,
Right.
it does raise some concerns about the reliability of eyewitness testimony, historical narratives, and even our personal relationships.
Okay, let's break that down. How could the Mandela effect impact eyewitness testimony?
Well, imagine you're a witness to a crime.
Okay.
You might have a strong memory of what happened.
Right.
But if that memory is influenced by other people's accounts
Right.
or by your own biases, it could lead to inaccurate testimony.
So even if a witness is genuinely trying to tell the truth,
Right.
their memory might not be a completely accurate representation of what actually happened.
That's right. And this is why it's so important for investigators
Yeah.
to gather evidence from multiple sources and to be aware of the potential for memory distortion.
That makes sense. What about historical narratives? How could the Mandela effect impact our understanding of the past?
Well, if enough people share a false memory of a historical event,
Right.
it could potentially rewrite history itself.
Wow.
Think about it. If millions of people believe that something happened a certain way, even if it didn't,
Right.
that belief can become ingrained in our culture and even influence future generations.
Wow, it's kind of scary. It's like a collective delusion that gets passed down through the ages.
It is a bit unsettling, and it highlights the importance of critical historical analysis
Right.
and the need to constantly reevaluate our understanding of the past history isn't static.
Right.
It's a dynamic process of interpretation and reinterpretation.
Okay, so we've talked about eyewitness testimony and historical narratives.
Right.
What about personal relationships? How could the Mandela effect impact those?
Well, imagine you and a friend have a shared memory of an event,
Okay.
but your memories differ in some key details.
Yeah.
Those discrepancies can lead to arguments, misunderstandings,
Right.
and even damage to the relationship.
So something as seemingly trivial as like a misremembered movie quote
Right.
could actually cause friction between people.
It's possible, especially if both parties are absolutely convinced that their memory is correct and the other person is wrong. It can become a battle of egos
Wow.
and a test of the relationship's resilience.
Okay, so the Mandela effect isn't just a fun little brain teaser.
Right.
It can actually have some serious real-world consequences.
It can.
It's a reminder that we need to be humble about the limitations of our memories
Yeah.
and be willing to consider other perspectives even when we're absolutely certain we're right.
Well said. And it's a reminder that communication is key.
Yes.
If you and someone else have conflicting memories of an event,
Right.
the best thing you can do is to have an open and honest conversation about it,
Right.
acknowledging the possibility that both of you might be remembering things differently.
That's great advice. It's about finding common ground
Yeah.
and respecting each other's perspectives, even when they differ from our own. I think that's a good lesson to carry with us beyond just the Mandela effect.
I agree. It's a lesson that can apply to so many areas of our lives.
Right.
And it's a reminder that open-mindedness and empathy are essential for building strong relationships and navigating a world that's full of different perspectives and interpretations.
Okay, so we've talked about how the Mandela effect can have consequences for things like legal cases and history.
Right.
But I'm still hung up on some of the examples,
Oh, yeah.
like Sex and the City.
Okay.
Why do I remember it as Sex and the City?
Right.
It just sounds more natural, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that's part of it. Our brains are kind of wired to look for patterns
Right.
and to simplify information.
Yeah.
So when we encounter something that's a little bit off grammatically, like Sex and the City,
Right.
our brains might automatically correct it
Yeah.
to a more familiar and honestly more logical phrase,
Right, like Sex and the City.
like Sex and the City. It makes sense.
Yeah. It's like our brains are saying, hey, this doesn't sound quite right. Let me just tidy it up a bit.
Exactly.
And sometimes that tidying up can lead to memory errors.
Yeah, especially when it comes to things we haven't thought about in a while. It's
No.
like our brains are filling in the blanks with what they think should be there
Right.
rather than what was actually there.
So it's not just about remembering things incorrectly.
Right.
It's also about our brains creating these entirely new memories.
Yeah.
Based on our
Exactly.
expectations and assumptions.
Precisely. And this tendency to correct information
Yeah.
isn't limited to grammar. We see it with logos,
Uh-huh.
product names, historical events, and even famous quotes.
Like Darth Vader.
Exactly, which
Yeah.
brings us back to Darth Vader.
Ugh, don't get me started. You're telling me he never said, Luke, I am your father.
I know.
I feel like my childhood is a lie.
It's tough. I know it's one of those Mandela effect examples that really messes with people.
Yeah.
But the truth is, the actual line is, "No, I am your father." The Luke part seems to have been added in our collective memory, perhaps because it just adds more drama and weight to the scene.
Yeah, I guess you're right. It does sound more dramatic with the Luke. It's
Yeah.
like our brains have turned it into this more impactful and memorable soundbite.
Exactly, and I think that's what's so fascinating about the Mandela effect. It's
Yeah.
not just these random memory glitches.
Right.
It's about how our brains actively shape and reshape our memories
Right.
based on all these different factors, emotions, cultural influences,
Right.
our desire for meaning and coherence.
So what does this all mean if our memories are this malleable?
Right,
How can we trust anything we remember?
right.
It's a little scary.
It is a little unsettling, but rather than seeing it as something to fear,
Okay.
I think we can view the Mandela effect as an opportunity
Right.
to become more mindful of how our minds work.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that our memories are not infallible, that they're constantly being shaped and reshaped by our experiences and interpretations.
Okay, so for our listeners out there, what's the takeaway? What can they do to navigate this world of, shifting memories and potential misinformation?
Yeah. I think the most important thing is to cultivate a healthy dose of skepticism.
Okay.
And critical thinking, don't just accept everything you hear or see at face value.
Right.
Even if it comes from a trusted source. Question your assumptions.
Right.
Cross-check information and be open to the possibility that your memory might not be as accurate as you think.
That's such an important point. And it's not about being cynical or distrustful.
Right.
It's about being curious and engaged and willing to really dig a little deeper to get to the truth.
Exactly.
Right.
The Mandela effect is a fascinating phenomenon that highlights the complexities of human memory and perception.
It is.
And by understanding how our minds work,
Yeah.
we can become more discerning consumers of information, more critical thinkers, and ultimately more in tune with the world around us.
That's a great point. And to our amazing listeners out there,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Mandela effect.
It's been fun.
It has been fun.
Mm.
We hope you learned something new,
Mm-hmm.
questioned some of your assumptions,
Right.
and maybe even had a few mind-blown moments along the way.
For sure.
Remember, keep questioning, keep
Yeah.
exploring, and keep those memories in check.
Absolutely.